With that, please join me in welcoming Dr. Barr.
Thanks. Hi. Well, thanks, Ken. Well, was it several months ago, Ken asked me to give a talk on marijuana.
Research.
Yeah, you picked right up on that. Anyway, thanks for having me here today. This is really why we have academic institutions in the first place. These thorny issues, the things that are challenging, are why we bring people from near and far to bring further thought and to ultimately find better ways for healthcare. And so it's really a privilege to be here. I have been associated with this institution for nearly 40 years. And I'll be bringing up some things as we go along. That first, I'd like to cover some basic question that we'll address, which basically is, should a physician provider provide compassionate use to cannabis while under federal prohibition? Because that's ultimately the major confounder that we've had now for nearly 80 years. And so I'll be addressing things that way. I'd like to cover, though, perhaps for the next 10, maybe 15 minutes, some background so you can hopefully glean from the way I see things as far as what issues there really are. This is not a didactic way to teach you the subtleties of a receptor system that is incredibly complicated, but wonderfully so in that it offers a tremendous amount of potential future research. So to get going then, what I'd like to start off with is, as we need to do, those full disclosures, but to basically tell you that we're here to talk about endocannabinoid science education and research ethics while under federal prohibition with the attestation disclaimers. And the interesting thing about the normal attestations that are given is it includes the statement about using things that are off-label. Well, essentially everything I'm going to talk about today is off-label because it's a Schedule I substance. So that being said, I don't have any affiliations with industry. And this is key because there really has been minimal education and research on this subject over the last many, many years. And as such, if it's as complicated as I've just told you it is, we're going to try to keep things relatively simple. This came out in 2013. And this was not by, some rookies. This is a paper that came out in terms of from MD, PhD researchers, NIH, real smart people. And I can tell you when I read this about the endocannabinoid system activity may have therapeutic potential in almost all disease affecting humans, I said, wow, that got my attention. I can't recall anything else ever being as profound as a statement like that. So I wanted to know more. I had already known some things about it because I had followed cannabis from when I grew up in this community as a kid, because I had a chemistry teacher in high school. Actually, it was down at Palmetto High School in this area, who was a hippie and was writing down on the blackboard the chemical formula for THC, which was new from the late 1960s. And so I then go off to Emory, get a degree in chemistry and learned more about it then, but it wasn't until the 90s that we had a mechanism of action to describe it. So ECS is endocannabinoid system, and very basically, it's something that's inherent in all of us. Just because you may not have really been hearing much about it decades ago, it doesn't mean it's not an ancient system. As a matter of fact, it's not only in human beings, it's not only in vertebrates, it's even found in invertebrates, and I'll tell you what it does. Essentially, what it does is it's there such that from birth through death, it actually gives a way to oversee virtually all other receptor systems to change the way those receptor systems work, but in very subtle ways that can affect your physiology and change things so that, in fact, over time, a disease that otherwise might do someone in soon becomes chronic because of the changes that we're built in to have. And where do you see it applied to? Well, there are CB1 receptors and CB2 receptors. There's much more knowledge about CB1 receptors covering the brain and basically the central nervous system, and they're there largely for things that control eating and sleeping in someone young. That's the essence of growth, and they are absolutely essential in regulating growth in the early stages of life. But as life continues into middle and even in old age, relaxing and forgetting, and I'm using these words of eat, sleep, relax, and forget, because these were describing words that were offered back in 1998 by the world's most frequently cited research in endocannabinoid science, a guy named Vincenzo DiMarzo. And the CB2 receptors now are different in that they serve and are located for the most part where immune system is. Think abdomen. And it makes sense that we would have a system that parallels our standard immune system, which responds to protein invaders, bacteria, viruses, things like that. Well, this is a little different in that it responds to those stresses to enable the physiology to change to withstand those stresses and allow whatever the disease state presenting that stress to become more chronic. So with that basic understanding of what the endocannabinoid system does, the overall message that I'd like to share for the future of research is that cannabis as a plant is something that merely identified that receptor system, not unlike an opium poppy flower identified what soon became known as the endorphin system. One was in 1975 with the endorphin system, early 1990s for the endocannabinoid system. I want to try to put perspective here. As Dr. Goodman was bringing up, I have been involved with the university trying to at least through the oath tell people the difference between right and wrong. And overall, we used to give the Hippocratic Oath. It's not that anymore. It's switched from the Oath of Maimonides that I took and now the Geneva Oath. But this is all germane because in ancient times, healers had to know about plants and ethical behavior because the earliest healers understood many of natural resources. That's what they had to work with. The irony of our talk today doesn't escape me from what happened last hour with another swearing in or inauguration of a new president, because we are in the midst of looking at this from medical and legal perspectives, and one of the biggest confounders are the differences that individual states have as compared to the federal government and understanding. So I want to quote this here because I think it's very powerful that without some common baseline of facts, without a willingness to admit new information and concede that your opponents are making a fair point and that science and reason matter, we'll keep talking past each other, making common ground and compromise impossible. So, somebody else who talks on this.
Yes, well, my position is that we have to see what the science tells us about the efficacy of marijuana, and I think we're going to get a lot more data on that. We have some preliminary data showing that for certain medical conditions and symptoms that marijuana can be helpful. So I think that we have to use that data to drive policymaking, and I'm very interested to see where that data takes us.
Dr. Vivek Murthy, we thank you.
I'll age myself here. I did go to high school, as I said, down here at Miami Palmetto High School in 1974. 20 years later, in 1994, Dr. Murthy was the valedictorian of our high school. So he has ties right here, too. This is the wording of the DEA in terms of what qualifies any given substance as a Schedule I substance. There are three components that usually are needed to be satisfied. It has to be a substance with a high potential for abuse, a drug or other substance that has no accepted medical use, and finally, is lack of accepted safety. Those criteria were established with the Controlled Substances Act in 1970, and that's what we are looking at in terms of the federal prohibition of which currently cannabis fits in that definition. Just last week, there was a major study released from the National Academy of Science, Engineering, and Medicine. And in it, for the first time being published since 1999, the 2017 edition now has done extensive research and balanced looking for evidence-based data supporting the use or not use of this. And so I'd like to share with you, hot off the press, actually it's pre-publication, these statements here because at least for these three instances, you have high potential for abuse, and it does give a comment, especially in kids. This is something that does have some evidence to show outcome, and we want to bear that in mind in thinking about the definition of a controlled Schedule I substance. Therapeutic use, well, apparently there is, and not just one thing, but in this case, staged to say that it has supporting evidence, a substantial evidence, or even conclusive evidence, and they're for different disease states. I'm not going to bother you with the details of which disease states may be currently ready for prime time, but I will share with you that we're partly here to discuss things subsequent to Florida, where we all live and where I'm licensed, dealing with Amendment 2, which passed last November and went into effect on the 3rd of this month. The reason I bring that up is that covers, I believe, 10 diagnoses, plus another that's anything else a physician might think qualifies, and yet not all of those seem to have met these standards. The American Medical Association, and I have a little lapel pin for my Florida Medical Association here, made a statement back in 1937 upon what was called the Marijuana Tax Act. And in 1937, they took a position, and this is William Woodward, MD and legislative counsel. They basically stressed that the AMA was concerned with making something that had previously been legal and culturally accepted and perhaps held some valuable information, of making it illegal, because it was not simply that Marijuana Tax Act, but the consequence of that, such that by 1942, the federal government no longer provided an educational resource on that. The United States Pharmacopoeia publishes monographs for things like St. John's wort, other plant-derived chemicals and things that you'll find used. But in this case, the last publication of that material ceased in 1942. And so we have nearly 75 years of really very poor resourcing of reliable education to drive research. However, if we look at what the AMA actually says today regarding an issue of confounding questions such as this, should a physician offer compassionate access to cannabis while under its federal prohibition, there is a position that the AMA has through its policies and procedures of medical ethics. And it says a physician shall respect the law and also recognize a responsibility to seek changes in those requirements which are contrary to the best interests of the patient. So that's our guiding principle from organized medicine. I wanted to share with you, though, some of the plant-based medicines that currently may be legal, may be illegal on top, and absolutely all of these have certain issues with addiction. So on the bottom left and the bottom middle, frankly, there's chocolate and coffee. And if anybody doesn't think that those are addicting, raise your hand, because they have those things. Obviously, they're legal and without constraints. While the bottom right of cocaine is a Schedule II drug. It's a local anesthetic is how it began. And of course, it's accessible and available for medical purposes, although, as Miami would remember from when I'm graduating medical school here in 1982 with Miami Vice days, South Florida was a place in the world where cocaine was flowing through here. And then, of course, above there's the opium poppy. We talked about that. Tobacco is tobacco, and it's still the leading cause of preventable death in the world. And yet cannabis sitting on top here is qualitatively different. It's unlike the other plant-based medicines in that the others are plant-based alkaloids. This is different, and it doesn't simply work through one receptor. It works through a combination of influences on virtually all receptors. So this was published shortly before the first constitutional amendment was held in Florida. And again, I have the badge here for the Florida Medical Association on my lapel. And I have to tell you, it concerned me, because the doc here is wearing that same type of identification. He's certainly saying something that doesn't appear to be too educated. There's a knee-jerk response to want to help pain because there were certain drives put into motion years ago to where pain needed to be treated. And the opiate industry, in fact, sees that moment. And in fact, it's amazing that I believe the United States consumes 80% of all the world's opiates. And that's quite an impressive figure, and I can't imagine that we just are genetically that inclined to that much pain. So there are other issues at bay. The difference in the similarities between opiates and the cannabinoids are impressive because of knowing that we do know the mechanisms of action for how they work. And they're used in balanced risk reduction every day from the opiates perspective. As a matter of fact, when Prince died last year, he was awaiting buprenorphine, a combination of two different components that work in a yin-yang way with effects that sort of act as an agonist and an antagonist that together, when you put them together, have a better safety profile. And there's certainly ample evidence that cannabis has certain balances of its cannabinoids as well as other chemicals called terpenes that have somewhat been lost from what may have been around many years ago. Under prohibition, the drug, mostly tetrahydrocannabinol, THC, the only psychotropic component, is the one that has been most featured, and through hybridizing has actually watered out, in a sense, the recessive genes of some of the other chemicals, especially cannabidiol or CBD. Again, I'm not going to get any more detailed into it than that to tell you that the biggest concern is that we know very little about dosing, and we know very little about the long-term effects of when you downregulate this particular receptor system. And so I like to use this quote here about if you can't control your dose can control you. And when I'm graduating medical school here, this is a good example of that. Because if you see the size of that spliff, and Cheech and Chong are hysterical, okay? But this, in evidence, is telling you that the concentrated amounts that are in today's cannabis, they weren't around back in 1978. As a matter of fact, if you look where the chemical content comes from in the plant, they come from little structures, mostly located on the flower buds of female plants. And that's where the concentrations have remarkably increased with hybridizing over the last 25 or 30 years, from about 4% back in '76 to now easily 20 and even higher than that percent nowadays. So it's a different animal than it was. So finally then, if you're going to look at what are the driving forces over these years, it's not simply that this is something that comes about as a result of wanting to get something stronger and stronger and stronger. There are even competitions that exist called the Cannabis Cup, which try to drive the plant in that direction. The thing that also is out there is capitalism. Big bucks, the venture capitalists that probably don't use it as this guy here looks like he's smoking because they know it's not good for you, but they're not beyond wanting to go ahead and use it in terms of a commercial venture. So in that sense then, one force is driving another, and I think we've got it a little backwards out there in terms of how influences are being shared. Florida, nevertheless, took the plunge last November, and it was quite remarkable that 71% of Florida's voters would think this needed to be a clear mandate. It was, and it still is. I might want to point out to you that 71.3% is about 50% more than the president who was inaugurated today won in Florida. So it's a pretty clear mandate. But what happens also that's interesting from the ethical perspective to see how industry from a recreational perspective as compared to a medical perspective is increasing, every good controversial subject needs a map. And here it is. The very light green colors are those states which currently have recreational law. The ones with stars just since November 8th, while the darker green states have had medical laws, and the ones with the stars there as well since November 8th. So obviously Florida just came in with medical law, but I'd like to point out to you something that is absolutely germane to understanding the dynamics of what's going on in the United States right now. From west to east, gradually there has been a progressive and very effective political mantra based on compassion. It started in the mid-'80s with patients with AIDS who were nauseated and throwing up with their chemotherapy, found that if you ate brownies laced with cannabis, that they may live to see another day, and it worked. More recently with children with epilepsy and the pathos that is evoked from children who have unrelenting diseases, in this case Dravet syndrome and unrelenting forms of epilepsy, has also, through a compassionate use mantra, been very effective politically. Now that's extending into vets with PTSD and a high suicide rate. So this has been the driving force through compassion, and that has to be part of our conversation. We are compassionate physicians. So of note here is that of the recreational states, all of those states have remarkably few people living across their borders, with one exception, Massachusetts. People think that, oh, well, it's what's going on in Colorado that's the future. No. Or that if the four original states before Election Day, which were Colorado, Washington State, Oregon, and Alaska, were going to dictate the future, that's wrong too. They have remarkably isolated borders. If people think that the 5% of the US population from those four states is what's determining the future, again, not so. Even with the inclusion of California, the additional four states now have pushed that total amount of Americans who have seen an interest in favor in saying we want recreational cannabis, now to 20%. California's borders are even isolated, but there are millions of people living right across Massachusetts' borders, and here's the shocker, folks, pot finds its way across borders. And that, in essence, may evolve to be, as alcohol did when it came out of prohibition, a model where different places in the country have different tolerances of how they plan to accept cannabis in their neighborhood backyard. The things that led to blues laws, or you can not drink it in here, or things like that. I do think that Massachusetts was the genie out of the bottle that now is not going back from this recreational perspective, and yet everybody's waiting on research because this is absolutely a temptation indulgence.
Maybe we'll build a wall.
Yeah, build a wall for that. There you go. Well, it's not coming up from Mexico the way it used to. Now it's being grown right here. So it is an indulgence temptation, and perhaps we should start to think of this from that perspective rather than as a drug. It did become recreationally legal in Nevada this year, and that's the height of indulgence and temptation, whether it's sex, video games, gambling, it's all there, and what is there may stay there. But the tolerance for how that may be accepted in one culture may be very different than in another culture if you took that same temptations indulgence mindset and realized that it equates to not a productive citizen. This cannabis is a production decliner. It does not increase productivity. So some states, perhaps Midwestern productive states, would have a lesser tolerance of this than those states currently that have brought this on recreationally. But here's the overall message. The genie is out of the bottle, and it does bring choices. And those choices are ones that caution us to be very careful what we wish for. And frankly, it comes back to what you had seen perhaps before, because science and reason matter. So now what I'd like to do is I'd like to advance this so that we can all start to have what I'm here for, which is a dialogue, by telling you that the previous statement of a medical legal statement from the perspective of the American Medical Association, if you remember, it said if a physician finds that a law is not conducive to their patient's well-being, they should advocate for a change in the law. That's failed. And it's failed really for two main reasons. The first is physicians are licensed not only in their state, but of course federally, and very few physicians are prepared to jeopardize their DEA license, their tool bag, to see a patient who wants to have cannabis, even therapeutically. So that's one confounder. Here's the other. As these different legislative measures have worked their way across the country, they are generally presented by presenting which cannabinoids can be used and for what diseases. The last time I looked at when you determine what medicines are used for what diseases, it was called the practice of medicine, and physicians are understandably resistant to being legislated the practice of what they're licensed and trained to know. So from that perspective, that same question that we spoke about before from a medical legal perspective, I'd like to propose to you a bioethical approach. Bioethics are the things that we have to think about that we didn't know we had to think about until we know that it's there. And very often you may think of the end of World War II and all the science discoveries that evolved from that time that confronted us with things. At this institution, it probably took a bioethical discussion a decade ago to get past some of the constraints of stem cells and research from limited cell lines that were allowed a decade ago. We've gotten well past that, and I'm very proud that my institution now has had tremendous benefits derived from that different thought. So for cannabis, perhaps the way to think about this, the same basic question of should a physician offer compassionate access to cannabis while under federal prohibition, would be done not so much in a Jeffersonian sense where you're trying to find a compromise where people who say yay or nay would find some common ground to agree on, but instead from approaching it from perhaps an irrefutable statement that would take into account why do human beings self-medicate? Why do they do things to alleviate stress? And why are there healers? Why are we doing what we do? So here's a proposed bioethical statement that we can start to discuss. You're welcome to bring any other aspects of this arena up, but I'd like to read it for you just so we have it down for the record, that seeking relief from physical, psychological, or spiritual symptoms of disease is an instinctual force of human nature and may contribute to medicinal use. The treatment of intolerable symptoms is an honorable task that a society bestows upon its healers to provide humane relief. We need to find some way to advance a dialogue, and that's why I'm very privileged to be here with you today, and I invite your comments. Anybody thinking anything you want to add here? And again, we're mic'd centrally, so if you can make your comments loud and clear, hopefully we'll pick it up. What I'd like to try to avoid doing is, this is a politically charged subject, so I'd like to try to avoid it from being political statements. The conversation advanced from one of social injustice to one of healthcare with the discovery of that mechanism of action of cannabis in the early 90s, and it's becoming more and more evident ever since.
Jeff, I have not seen any statements from the AMA. Why has the AMA not come out and made a position statement, a white paper on this issue to address the DEA's recent decision?
Great question. And the answer to your question, as I see it, is the same reason that we haven't seen our local FMA make a statement. The reason, as I see it, and I shared this recently with the president of the Florida Medical Association, is the Florida Medical Association and the American Medical Association are truly physician advocacy organizations. The physicians as individual human beings, healers, are the patient advocates. There's a difference. When we looked at the numbers of members, say just here in Florida as an example, there are 20,000 physician members of the Florida Medical Association. A few weeks ago, there were barely over 200 physicians in Florida who had taken the mandated course who expressed an interest to authorize patients in Florida to receive cannabis. The numbers don't match up that way because each of those members contributes PAC funds and dues. The agenda is one of what do most of the docs want, and at this point, is my point here, that the overwhelming majority of physicians in organized medicine have said, not as long as this is federally prohibited. That's my read of it. Of that note, there's been some criticism in Florida in the last day or two about the Department of Health. And I want to share with you again, the Department of Health, its job, its role, they have very fine people there, thought leaders too. But their role is largely one of making rules to support law, not to create the law. And they are in a position, even though the mission statement talks about a healthy Florida and that type of a mindset, they're somewhat limited in what they do in that they also do not necessarily directly advocate for patient well-being. It's a processor type of a position, including the Florida Board of Medicine, which is within the Department of Health. So government constraints in this issue have been overt, and people expect more than is really their responsibility and job. Organized medicine as well. People expect more. Why doesn't the AMA say this? So one thing I can say for sure is we brought up earlier with respect to Dr. Murthy when he was giving his comment about what's needed with research, we got it right here. Not only do we have it right here, but if you think about it, here's what's special about the University of Miami. The University of Miami is sitting in the third most populous state in the country. We have 20 million people. The southeast coast here, multi-genetic at that. Research here could happen with great significance to the federal understanding and international understanding of what cannabis can be for and shouldn't be for. Florida is also unique in a different way, and Miami, because if you think about it historically, when the university opened in 1926, Al Capone is running through Miami. And I mentioned when I graduated medical school in '82, it's Miami Vice and cocaine. And we can still go that direction about 2 miles, and if you were fishing, you might just pull up what's called a square grouper. Anybody know what that is? A bale of pot. So Miami has been front and center in this for decades, and there really is little reason that we wouldn't be an ideal place to study it responsibly. And here's one last perspective on Miami and the university to think about. The university is under new leadership, and in 2026 we'll have our centennial. The university opened in 1926. In 1926, cannabis was legal and alcohol was illegal. That's where we are.
Do current laws neither, actually, head of the AAAS, Al Mesher gave a talk here. It was introduced by President Shalala. And they had great sport. It turns out that there's a license to actually grow marijuana that the United States had in the day. And it turns out the name of the Secretary of Health and Human Services needed to be the name on the license. And when it became Shalala, there was a transfer of title to the university, the country's marijuana farm. Do current laws inhibit research? I mean, the access to physicians is one thing, but what is it about current law that makes it difficult, if anything, to actually do the research on the endocannabinoid system that might, as you pointed out at the beginning, has nothing to do with pain management?
Again, questions about research, what's the federal disposition on it? It's changing. It's actually changing quickly. To give you examples, traditionally many institutions were reluctant to research it because there were certain constraints in doing research on an illegal drug that they felt might threaten other federally funded research. I believe that the federal government has gotten past that. This was addressed, and I spoke with Dr. Jay Weir about that about a year or so ago, and ever since, in particular, from a formal declaration on it, last August, the DEA, through petitioning, came out with a statement that said for the time being it will stay Schedule 1, but at the same time, they announced that they were planning to do things that significantly relaxed the restrictions on research, including the only source of where it comes from, which happens to be the farms at the University of Mississippi. That's what you're describing. And all of the researched cannabis would go through the National Institute of Drug Abuse, but the growing source was there. And frankly, they were growing things that were, in the eyes of the growers out on the West Coast, sort of something of unimaginably limited, what they consider quality, but low potency and ground up twigs and everything in it. So the rest of the country has been consuming varietals for the last 20 or 30 years. Now, not only the University of Mississippi, but apparently in short order, other sources of material are going to be resourced. And not only that, but I'll tell you that last March, the FDA has a new commissioner, Robert Califf. And he was asked, sort of what you were bringing up now, about things concerning what made cannabis unique. Remember I said it's a compound, it's not just one chemical. People think that the FDA has always and forevermore will only look at individual chemicals for individual diseases with individual patents for approval. And so there were several people in that NIH summit who were basically accusing the FDA of not wanting to work with it. Well, the new commissioner took exception to that. And he said that no, we are ready to do that, especially now, because that's part of the mindset of the Man on the Moon mission to try to find a cure for cancer. It's not one magic bullet. It's ways to surround the disease state. And so he was just saying that we haven't yet been presented with appropriate studies to check for the combinations of those chemicals. I'll share with you that as a botanist, grower, and a plant expert, that cannabis and many plants evolve with human beings because of its balance of chemicals. It's not one magic bullet from a plant's perspective. And I think to consider just THC or just cannabidiol CBD is very short-sighted in both respects. And actually it was Deepak Chopra who said something along the lines of, to isolate a single chemical from a plant is an affront to nature. It's like extracting the chemical and leaving the wisdom behind. So that's the way Eastern cultures have understood plants. That's the reason you will never find, for instance, a physician of traditional Chinese medicine offering one herb. It's half a dozen, 10 different things that in combination exert the effects they do. So part of my approach that way may be the constraints in which we're trained as Western trained physicians as compared to a traditional way of looking at nature and the integration that we have within our ecosystem.
Can you just explain why Colorado is not the example we should be shooting for?
Again, a great question, because now we're going to talk not simply about research, but we're going to talk about education. I've had the privilege to go there and to talk with Department of Health people, with certain legislators, as well as to see some of the growing facilities and the culture. The culture in Colorado where this started is markedly different than many or most other places in the country. And it attracts certain people with zealous beliefs and understandings of what otherwise we might call libertarianism. And I'm not making political statements here, but I'd like to share one aspect of that with you. And to address your point about what Colorado has done right versus wrong, I had the chance to go into some of these dispensaries. Dispensaries, of course, are the point of patient contact. It is not a pharmacy. And the person usually there advising is affectionately called a bud tender, like flower buds, not bartender, bud tender. And one of the first questions I asked when I went in there, I said, could you please tell me something about your lab services? And the bud tender looks at me and says, lab? Anyway, there really was no lab service. So they do have labeling of the cannabinoids that are in the recreational products. Normally what you'll do is you'll find a jar, and it has a bunch of these flower buds in there, sold by weight or pieces, and it has a funny name on it. Snoopy Dog Kush, something like that. And the experience for the person coming in is they'll take that jar, open it up, look in it, looks like Snoopy Dog Kush. Doesn't say what the chemicals are. Smells like it. And then, well, you know what, I'll take one, and if I like it, I'll come back for more. That's the medical side too. So it's different. As a matter of fact, while the recreational side in Colorado requires the listing of the chemical cannabinoids, in a confounding way, the medical side doesn't. But here's really in two respects where I don't think they got it right. The initial laws there were done with $10 million going to research. Made a lot of people say, hey, wow, we've done a good thing. Well, number one, that's a drop in the bucket. And number two, there was no ongoing resource of revenue, so that's been spent. They got nothing else to provide, researching it in the one place of the country that's been perhaps the most vital potential lab for use and abuse anywhere in the country, maybe anywhere in the world. So that's opportunity missed. But here's the other thing that makes it different. I'm a medical doctor. I have a license here in Florida. I know that I need, every time I renew my license, a minimum of 40 hours of CME, Continuing Medical Education Credit, approved by the AMA. It's called PRA1. And all states and commonwealths require approximately that amount, 20 or so, 20 to 30 hours every year, so depending on how often you renew your license, 40 to 60 credit hours usually when you get your license. There's two exceptions, and the two exceptions are Colorado and Montana. Now, not that there aren't bright people. I've spoken with many bright docs in Montana, but there's a subculture of docs who are fiercely libertarian. Anybody care to guess how many hours does a Colorado licensed physician need when they renew their medical license? Anybody? 0. So you have certain docs out there who may be their brightest when they graduated medical school 40 years ago. Damn the torpedoes. And so when you're asking me about things that are right or wrong without value statements, it's such a new science that not to educate in it, it's not simply research. I know the seminar we're here is ethics in research, but it's such a new science that it's not a chicken and an egg thing. We got to educate only once you know the research, or you got to do research to find what to educate. They have to be done in parallel because nobody knows these answers yet. It's that important to get it not only into the research curricula, but into the medical school students' curricula. I believe if that's done at this institution now, in 4 years' time, when it may come out of federal prohibition, we will be ready with perhaps the first real well-trained physicians to be tomorrow's clinicians and researchers who actually know about it. So the essence and the importance of this subject now, the knowledge base that's out there, the opportunities to educate and research, the time is now. Yes?
I'm always perplexed with how the federal government was giving for 20 years Robert Randall, he was a professor from University of California. They were giving him medical marijuana, and they were giving 20 other people, and then they say they don't have any research.
Well, what you're referring to, Robert Randall, actually in the late 70s, let me tell you who Robert Randall is. Robert Randall is the first citizen to petition the federal government to have cannabis to treat his glaucoma. He's passed away several years. His wife Alice is still vital in Sarasota. Yesterday I presented with grand rounds at the Bascom Palmer Eye Institute with a featured case presentation of a young girl with glaucoma. So I refreshed my knowledge of this subject before, right up until current data on it. The fact is, the study you're talking about, the investigational new drug study from the mid-'80s, had approximately 30 different people who had different diseases who petitioned the government and then were accepted to a program where they would receive from the federal government cannabis to treat a certain disease. Of those 30 people, the program was shut down in the early 90s, so there haven't been new people added. Here's another tie to the University of Miami. I believe there's 4 living descendants from that program, only 2 who were not anonymous, and each of those 2 are followed and receive their cannabis from this institution. Those are the last 2. One of them receives it for glaucoma, the same diagnosis that Robert Randall used it for. This is my point, though. Obviously, people who use the cannabis from those studies are consuming, and they receive 300 joints in a tin can every month. And one of those people here at the University of Miami, who is absolutely an advocate who receives it for glaucoma, I need you to know was accepted into that study and is still followed by the people who I presented with yesterday, because her particular kind of glaucoma is a 1 in 10,000 varietal. Nothing else worked. So she is the exception, not the rule. However, when you have somebody that years ago brought that particular diagnosis, it's marched right with legalization across the country as a qualifying diagnosis, and yet today most patients would do far better with eye drops. And here's my full disclosure. I have glaucoma. I've detached my retina. I'm followed. I'm a frequent flyer at Bascom Palmer Eye Institute, probably always one of the first 2 ranked hospitals in the country for the last 15 years. The finest researchers who understand cannabis there recognized yesterday, when I brought up just last Thursday's disposition on glaucoma, which is the same disease. So I'll share with you that the final conclusion as of now, it's actually pre-publication, is that there is limited evidence to support that cannabis is ineffective for glaucoma. That's the wording. I'm quoting that. So the study that recently came out, according to what works and what doesn't, gave dispositions not only for glaucoma, but for many other diseases. There were only 3 things that it says it actually has evidence for. It says that there's evidence that it works for patients who have chronic pain. In other words, double-blind, significant studies, and it's gone through enough testing and research to say that that's the first one, and they call that evidence to support its use, not ineffective or inadequate like for glaucoma. But chronic pain, evidence. The next one concerns the muscle spasms associated with multiple sclerosis, and that is worded as having substantial evidence. The third that has conclusive evidence is the nausea and vomiting associated with chemotherapy, wasting syndromes, AIDS. Those kinds of things have conclusive evidence such that you have those 3 big things that are now showing a preponderance of data in support that there is a therapeutic use, which goes to the definition again of what a Schedule I substance would be expected to have or not have. Hope that answers your question. Rather long-winded, but we just did glaucoma yesterday. Thank you.
I had 3 questions. One was, has NIH, I'm sorry if I missed this, if you already said, has NIH actually funded studies, like for, trials with marijuana or THC? Number 2, in the states where it was legal, medical marijuana was legal, did insurance companies pay for? How was that covered under the person's insurance? And number 3, I had heard that there's an association with schizophrenia. And I'm wondering if you have heard anything. It just didn't probably.
3 things, so let me try to move through them quickly. The schizophrenia thing, it's known that in the wrong person, it's not a good thing. There's actually a genetic variant that's been identified in particular with psychoses and things. However, most of the work in that arena actually comes out of Germany, where you expect the Dr. Freud descendants to want to look into this. Again, it's one of those diagnoses that right now doesn't have the benefit of enough data to show that it's effective or not. But yes, in certain predisposed people, it can make things worse. And yet stress disorders may manifest themselves in different ways such that even Alzheimer's, some people are saying, does it work? It may even help some people. There's a lot we don't know. So that's the schizophrenia aspect of it. Remind me the second part, the second question part.
Well, okay, the second one was on where the states where medical marijuana.
Okay, insurance doesn't cover it, no, and they don't expect that to happen absolutely while it's still federally prohibited. And the
other one was NIH funding.
NIH funding, yeah, the answer to your question is absolutely yes. The National Institute of Drug Abuse that works within the NIH has been doing studies on this for years and years. However, the NIDA stands for National Institute of Drug Abuse. So their focus and mandate is to look in areas of abuse, harm. If it was called the National Institute of Drug Use, you'd probably have a different balance to the studies that came out. In the more recent past, though, you do have now starting up different federally funded research to include research that's getting ready to start right now on PTSD, for instance. Part of that was funded from the proceeds that were the one-time thing through Colorado. And so it's evolving, it's changing. And so now I believe in the future you'll see a far greater opportunity for a balance looking for abuse effects versus therapeutic use effects, especially when you have the paper that came out last week from the National Academy of Science, Engineering, and Medicine. Yes, ma'am.
So since insurance doesn't cover it, what would you say is the actual approximate cost, like per patient, and is it accessible to people of different socioeconomic status?
The thing you're bringing up is a fascinating subject because now you're talking about where are they going to get what. You have black market prices, you have prices in states where it's becoming legal, and one plays against the other. When a state where it becomes legal taxes it beyond a certain point and it becomes too expensive for the person to access, there it absolutely preserves a vital black market. And otherwise, if it's quality control, you would assume, and it's a safe assumption if there's regulations and compliance for the non-illicit market, that it would be presumably safer if it were being grown by a state-approved or inspected type of entity. The last time I looked it depends again for what the treatment of disease is, the number of $690 per month for some treatment I saw written. However, that was a very loose number that came out of it because it's not one size fits all. What I'll share with you again, this goes into the clinical application of it, is that cannabis is grossly overdosed. Grossly overdosed. Most therapeutic responses in cannabis, with very few exceptions, seem to require a tiny little dose where the effectiveness is seen in what's called an inverted U response, meaning if you have too little, it doesn't work. You get to a certain amount, it works. This is including for pain. But you have more than that amount, and not only doesn't it work, but you may have worsening of effects. So you want to try to find the therapeutic window for where it works. It's so small that the therapeutic cost of that small dose is pennies. The industry from growing will evolve to where this will be incredibly cheap out the farm door, and it'll be then an industry of branding. And I'm talking about that a joint a few decades from now will probably cost for content about 4 cents, the content in it. So it'll be all about branding, and it will be a giveaway type of a thing. Even think of a pack of sugar in a restaurant. That's likely where it could go if it was that available. And so you think, well, maybe they'll give it away in a we actually had a discussion about this. Give it away in a restaurant to have people want to come in, because if you look at the way it's used today by most people, about 60% of people who use cannabis use it essentially only on weekends. It's actually 8 or less days a month. And they're the ones who would use it to maybe pass around a joint in a meal to stimulate the food or the conversation, not unlike the way that you get a bottle of wine to share with some friends on a Saturday night. The alcohol industry does not make money from the housewife buying one bottle of Chablis in Publix once a week. The cannabis industry doesn't make money on one person using it on weekends. Both industries and tobacco expect that you'll have some chronic, heavy users that support their product. And the numbers are here. Approximately 2/3 of all users of cannabis, with using it as infrequently as they do, account for 2% of consumption. Not much. However, 10% of the users of cannabis use it 30 times a month, basically every day. That 10% represents nearly 2/3 of the industry's consumption and income. Those are powerful numbers. They're the same kinds of balancing that happens with tobacco and alcohol. So that's the interest financially of industry. And those 10% of everyday users, they happen to be among our most vulnerable citizens, patients. A lot are lower socioeconomic status, and they're vulnerable. And that's why I brought up before about who are the patients' advocates in this arena. Doesn't mean it shouldn't be available for research or therapeutic use, but that's a major concern of our government for what happens to those people, because once it gets in industry and once it's out there in terms of a pure form and cheaper, the likelihood of, and this is an estimate, but it's not at all unreasonable to assume a doubling of use, including the chronic, then you have to weigh what is the true cost versus benefit of a therapeutic use versus a cost to the society in terms of productivity. And even after you, pardon the phrase, weed out the variables such as psychiatric care or addiction care and things associated with use and abuse, there's one part of cannabis that makes it absolutely different than tobacco and alcohol or opiates. Cannabis has a selective function on the hippocampus, the part of the brain where memory is stored and made and stored. By cannabis's effect on the hippocampus, I think you're looking at a potential of more than a doubling, because the self-check, the things that human beings do to say, maybe I'm getting in trouble with this. The alcoholic or narcotic user even who might say, you know what, I'm on my 3rd job or my 4th wife or things like that. That's a reality gut check that some people respond to and are able to pull back. I question if with cannabis that's possible simply because of its effects on memory in an ongoing way. This is a profound thought, but this is how we establish this kind of dialogue to bring perspectives that otherwise we may not have brought into a conversation.
I know you referred to the taxation side and policy more so in regards to alcohol, but in previous talks we've talked about the process following the same path as cigarettes. And I also want to hear what your thoughts are on the aspect of research in regards to the overwhelming slide towards recreational use.
Cigarettes are really a model you need to look at because there should be lessons learned from the tobacco industry. Last February, the University of California, San Francisco's Public Health Department published an extensive study on just that. If you think about it, when Ken and I are in high school, if somebody says, hey, you want to go back behind the gym and have a smoke, they're talking about a cigarette, tobacco. The same thing asked today, you want to smoke or vape, it's cannabis. So if you look at what happened in public health, starting on the West Coast and working east, while cigarettes are legal, in California, after their clean air emissions from vehicles came an intolerance to tobacco for use, secondhand smoke, and the tobacco use, especially in California, has been dropping. That's a social health policy victory. Really a big one, because I told you that it is by far the leading cause of preventable death. Cannabis, on the other hand, is illegal, and I don't necessarily think it should be. There's not a need to throw another inner city kid in jail for a joint. So In that sense, though, while it's illegal, its social use is increasing as it's becoming more condoned as it works its way across the country as a medicine. Be very careful when you say to somebody it's a medicine, because they think it's actually maybe good for you, or it's different. Alcohol is a toxin. Cannabis does have therapeutic use. Does nicotine? Possibly, but probably nowhere near in exchange for the mechanism of action on how it's taken in. Smoking, combustion releases entirely different chemicals that are in the tobacco leaf or in the cannabis leaf, and those potentially have great peril. So overall, to answer your question and tie it together here, we're talking about cannabis, but there are lessons from tobacco, alcohol, opiates. The difference here, we know the mechanism of action, it probably has a better safety profile, and there is at least a generation or two of potential research ahead. It's that complex of a system. Thank you.